Hello, everyone. Welcome to another video of History by Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. David Miano. He is an ancient historian specializing in the histories of the Near East, Egypt, Greece, Rome, India, and China. He earned his PhD at the University of California, San Diego, and is the author of Shadow on the Steps, Time Measurement in Ancient Israel, geared toward scholars, How to Know Stuff, a little ebook designed for the general public, and several anthologies designed for classroom use, including Ideas in the Making, a source book for world intellectual history to 1300 and pen stylus, and Chisel, an ancient Egypt source book. He also runs a YouTube channel called World of Antiquity, which is linked in the description below. So without further ado, welcome to History by Podcast, Dr. Miano.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you for joining me. Let's get right into it. So what do you think drives people these days to believe in pseudo-historical and pseudo-scientific theories? And they make videos on YouTube. You've seen them, you've debunked them. It gets hundreds of thousands of views. People are for some reason flocking to this nonsense, a lot of them. And I think that debunking has helped, and it's got a lot of people away from it, but a lot of other people continue to go into it. And then they'll create other conspiracy theories saying, oh, those YouTube channels are working for the government or secret societies. You know what I mean. So what do you think's going on there?
Well, I think there are different kinds of people that come to it and are interested in it. For most people, I think they're not necessarily choosing it as, oh, I like this because it is pseudo-historical or something like that. They don't think it's
Right.
pseudo-history. A lot of it just is they are interested in ancient history and they don't know a lot about it. So people can tell them anything, you know. Someone could say, oh, did you know this? And did you know that? Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that before. And they're just drawn in because it's interesting. The fact is, people who do peddle pseudo-history are make it interesting, right? They make it more like a movie or like science fiction or fantasy or whatever. And people like that kind of stuff. And they love the mystery. Oh, we don't know this and we don't know that. Could it be this? Could it be that? People love that stuff. So the purpose of my channel is to say, oh, well, do you know why archaeologists or historians say that didn't happen or why they think this happened? And then I'll explain it to them. Some people are a little bit more hardline, right? They are anti-establishment as a principle, right? This is like, okay, I don't like the mainstream. I don't like the establishment. And I automatically suspect them of lying to me. And so they're drawn to it for those reasons. But I don't think that's most people. That's some people. Most people just think it's cool, you know. So that's kind of, I think, where they're coming from.
Right. And there are some people out there that do exist that they are so into it that they won't believe anything that comes out of the mainstream because they don't trust them. And so I'll believe anything that's contrary to the government, archaeologists. Those people are out there too, and that is, I think, worrisome. But you've done a video on ancient monuments, which is one of my favorite videos on your channel, in which you are debunking the way people look at these monuments and say, well, they say primitive people couldn't have made these monuments. They say it's too advanced. There are people claiming that cranes can't even lift those blocks on the pyramids, those stones. What do you make of all that?
Yeah, it's one aspect of it is denying what the expert consensus is on a matter by being skeptical of it. So it's not just like, oh, we have these cool ideas of our own. It's like these ideas of the mainstream are terrible, you know, and it's mainly incredulity. Like, I just can't understand how anyone could possibly do that. And this incredulity is based on their own personal experience, which is largely limited. In fact, all of our experiences are limited because none of us were there at the time. And you know, we don't understand completely how people back then thought or how they worked or whatever. We have to piece it together from the evidence that they left behind. But if you don't even look at anything I should say, if you don't look at the historical context, what was the culture like? What beliefs did the people have? Why did they do the things that they do? How did they live their daily lives? If you don't study any of that and you only look at the stones, you know, you can come up with all kinds of ideas. And also you might not understand many things. Like, and this is another thing that people do. They compare what they see with what they know. Oh, this looks like this thing from my experience. Therefore, it must be that, right? It looks like it. Therefore, it is it. Now, we see this more extreme examples, like when they'll look at something and they'll say, oh, that Egyptian hieroglyph looks like a helicopter. So therefore, it must be a helicopter. Or that looks like a dinosaur. Or that looks like a nuclear explosion. Or whatever. That looks like DNA. We just compare it to something that we know, and we just assume that that must be what it is. When in fact, it could be any number of things. And if you study the culture and their symbols, it starts to make sense. And then you realize, oh, it wasn't the thing that I thought. It's this other thing. And it goes also not just for art or writing or anything like that, but also for, you know, what stones look like, the cuts that apparently are in them, the holes that are apparently in them. You know, we think, oh, that looks like a modern drill made it or a modern saw cut it. And then when we study it, and of course experimental archaeology does this too, we realize, oh, wait a minute, other things can make those same marks. And it's just a matter of more study, more research, and more experimentation. And then you realize, oh, it's not what I thought it was.
And speaking on what you were saying earlier, that you know, people look at this stuff because it also sounds very exciting. It really drives the emotional thrill in people, because people think that, oh, this makes the ancient past look cooler, believing these things. Because it seems to me that these people want the past to be something more than it was. They don't like the history as it's taught. They want it to be something greater, something bigger, something more magnificent. Do you think that's what's going on too, to an extent? I'm not saying they're all doing it for that reason, but some people probably
Sure.
are doing
Yeah.
it for that reason.
Yeah. It's not the same old thing that you hear in school. It's something different, something more exciting. Now, this is not to say that regular history isn't exciting. I think it's very exciting. I get enthused about it. But it is true, archaeologists are, I'm a historian, but same thing with historians. Archaeologists and historians get excited about some things that maybe other people think are boring. Like an archaeologist will find a broken pot and be like, wow, look at this ceramic pot I found, you know? And people are like, what? Who cares about that? I want to talk about spaceships or something. Or I'll find an inscription, you know, I think the inscription is really cool. I guess it just depends on what you like. But if you choose to believe something merely because it is more interesting or more exciting, that's not a good gauge as to whether it is correct or not, right? Usually, the most mundane, ordinary explanation is closest to the truth, right? Because most things play out as they always play out. That's just how things are. That's how people are. That's what people do. And when you think of it, could be something out of the ordinary. Well, you've heard the expression, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But to an extent, that's true, because if you are positing that something happened that is not usual, and you have choice between choosing, okay, it could be the usual thing, or it could be this unusual thing. Well, which of those two do you need stronger evidence for? You need stronger evidence for the unusual thing, right? In most cases, it's probably the simplest, most basic explanation.
And there are people out there that look at but the Nazca lions, and they say, well, how could primitive people have created that? Because you can only see what they're trying to picture when you look at it from the sky on an airplane. That's what they'll say. So they'll say they couldn't have done that, even though, despite the fact that the Nazca lions look like animals from the sky, they'll say they were used as ancient airports.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the thing is, it's clearly the intention of the makers for it to be seen from the sky. But the mundane explanation is they wanted the spirits in the sky to see it, the gods or whatever. It was a message. It's like a message when you're stranded on a desert island and you want to write something like help on the sand and use stones to make a big help sign for a plane going over, right? It doesn't mean you were in the sky. It doesn't mean you were in the plane, but you were trying to design it for somebody who was up there. And it can be done from the ground. You just have to have a wider vision, but it can be done from the ground.
Yeah, and speaking of Mesoamerican stuff, like they'll look at the Mesoamerican pyramids. They'll say, yeah, the design looks a little different, but it's also reminiscent to them of the ancient Egyptian pyramids. And they'll say, well, there must be a cross-cultural connection. They'll come up with stuff like ancient Egyptians must have visited the Americas. Or they'll say that aliens built both, and they had this international collaboration of civilization, something like that.
Yeah, the practice of looking for similarities between things in different cultures is a big part of this kind of movement. Oh, look at this over here. It looks a lot like this over here. There must be a link. There must be a connection. But sometimes these links are very tenuous. They're just very basic similarities. Oh, this is a building that is big at the bottom and small at the top. How could anyone think of that without somebody else showing it to them? This is the thinking. Very basic, very simple similarities. But at the same time, they, in a single culture, in a single area, in one country, they want to break links. When I say break links, I mean they say they want to take this artifact and they want to say, well, the artifact was made by this culture, but then a different culture put the writing on it or something like that. So they want to separate that. Oh, these are not connected. The writing and the object that the writing is on, they're not connected. But this building over here looks kind of like this building over on another continent. They're connected, So it's kind of a strange way of thinking where more natural connections, they're in the same place, okay? They're on the same object. Those, there's no link. But when they're far away, thousands of miles apart, then there's a link. Oh, they must be connected. So it's a little bit counterintuitive to think like this, but they need to do that in order to make their hypothesis work.
When they see little figurines or depictions of things that they say looks like ancient astronauts, as I like to call them, what are they really looking at? Are they depictions of other people and they're misinterpreting them as ancient astronauts, or could it be that they're depicting deities and they're not, and that these people claiming that they're ancient astronauts are misinterpreting what they represent?
Well, it depends on the object, of course, and what is being depicted. But this is what I was talking about before, where you look at things that that are familiar to you, and then you see an ancient depiction and you say, oh, it looks like what I know. So, that kind of looks like a space helmet, or that kind of looks like a rocket. So you're assuming that what you think it looks like from your own personal experience is what it is. And they're doing that. Also, I guess it should be mentioned that it's a common belief among at least the ancient aliens crowd, that stories that talk about gods and the ancient myths, so forth, those gods are not fictional. They're not made up. They're real, but they're aliens. Okay, the gods are the aliens, and the people didn't understand that they were aliens, and so they just thought they were gods. I mean, the idea in itself is not that far-fetched, but then you think about, well, wait a minute, their gods look human. Their gods are spoken of as being like they have two arms, two legs, they have a face, they look like people, because the ancient people created gods in their own image. They just assumed that they were like them. So what are the chances that an alien would fit that description? Or when we have these mythical creatures that are hybrids, human body with an animal head, which are clearly inventions of people. They're like, oh, let's take an animal and mix it with a human in our mythology, and we have this god. But then they'll come up with scientific theories like, well, somebody was doing genetic experiments, and they crossed an eagle with a human or whatever, and they came up with this. But this is all very science fiction. There's they're taking fantasy elements and trying to make it sound scientific. But genetically, is it even possible to create someone with a human body and a bird's head? Can that actually occur? Can a creature of that type actually exist? Can it live and breathe? And clearly not. But again, they're trying to take these myths and put a scientific spin on them. Say, well, they're true, but not in the sense that the ancients believed that they were true. They're true in a scientific sense, like we think today, But anyway, yeah. So there's that aspect to it too.
And it was sometimes common practice back in the ancient world for people to make stuff, build stuff, and even attribute monuments to gods. Like there's like in ancient Egypt, there's a story about Atum. They say that Atum built the Ben structure,
Mm-hmm.
and it looks like the pyramids.
Or called the Ben forth from the waters, and it was
right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think if I remember correctly, they're talking about the walls of Troy, in which Poseidon and Apollo, in a myth, were supposedly punished into making them. So they're trying to attribute these walls to the gods when they were clearly built by human hands.
Oh yeah, I see. Like they'll talk about the Cyclopean walls or something like that.
I could be misremembering which wall they were talking about, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of interesting too that there is a tendency to want to discard inscriptions that talk about contemporary events. Like, people are writing things and they'll tell you, oh, this is what we did and this is whatever. And they'll say, oh, not interested in that. I'm interested in the myths. Oh, they're the things that are trustworthy. They're the things that are true. It's the exact opposite of what, of course, historians would say. Because when you think about it, right, here you have these myths that are stories about the supernatural, right? They're fantastical in their very nature. And these are the stories that people want to take as being real. But then other things like, oh, someone signed their name to an artifact, like, I made this. And they're like, don't believe that. It's a lie. So it's just very strange, like, what is the reasoning behind that? Why is this believable, but that's not believable, right?
It seems like to me they're trying to it's basically special pleading. They want to separate the inscriptions on the structure because they're trying to say these structures were built by more advanced people, and then primitive people just wrote on them. All over the world.
Yeah. And they just took credit, they just took credit for it. And I know they do bring up examples like in Egypt, Ramses II would take a previous king's statue and then write his name on it. That did happen. Now, of course, we know that happened because we can see how the original was altered, right? Now, they take that and they say, well, this is proof that of our theory that, later people just claimed it. Now, no one is arguing that later people couldn't claim something from earlier. Certainly that could be the case, but we don't conclude that happened unless we have the evidence for it. So we don't say Ramses stole this and wrote his name on it just because we felt like it or because he did it over here. No, each object we examine and we look for the evidence, like, is there evidence of tampering and changing something on it, right? But they say, well, it was blank. The ancient lost culture, they made it blank, and then somebody else wrote their name on it. And they'll say this even about objects that were made to be written on. Like they'll actually say this about like something that was made as a monument to have a message. And they'll say, oh, somebody made it without a message, and then somebody else wrote on it. Well, like, why would you make a stela, for example, which is supposed to have writing on it, and then not put anything on it? Yeah, it's very strange. And also, it's always about stone, right? So when we think of the history of the world, we think of stone technology as one of the earliest and most primitive technologies. But for them, stone technology is the greatest of all technologies. There's nothing better than stone. And I'm not sure where that comes from, but that's kind of how they talk about it. Like, but they'll say, well, it's because it's so heavy, so large, or they'll say it is so perfectly cut. And we're not talking about like intricate art, or something very fancy, which really takes a lot of skill and a lot of work. We're talking about just basic rectangles and squares, right? They're like, oh, look at this basic rectangle. Wow. The Egyptians could not have made that basic rectangle. That's just too hard to make it so straight like that, But then you see like a beautifully carved sarcophagus with a face on it or something. They're like, oh yeah, they could have made that. That was easy. But the basic lines, no, they couldn't have done that. That's just too hard. It's very strange to think that way, but that's how people think.
And methodologically speaking, how do historians tell when a structure did not originally have writing on it, but it was written later, like what Ramses did, for example?
Well, there's a few different ways. The easiest way is when you see that Ramses, sometimes they'll have both names on it, like they'll have the earlier king's name and Ramses' name. But other times you'll see he might try to cover it up or scratch it out. But there's remnants of tampering, of trying to scratch it out. And then his name might not match some of the other writing that's on the monument. He might keep some of the other writing, the king is great and all this kind of stuff writing. He wants to keep that. So he'll put his name on, but it doesn't match. It's like, oh, you can tell this was put down at a different time as the writing of the other writing. Or you can see the statue and you're like, wait a minute, I know what this earlier king looks like, and that's him, right? And I know what Ramses looks like, and he looks like this over here. So how is it a name on this statue, right? Looks like he took the earlier king's statue. So things like that, There's a famous, well, I don't know how famous, but at Tanis, there's an obelisk that's lying as part of a wall. It was used in a wall. And you can see where there was a hieroglyphic inscription on it, but then it was plastered over and another inscription was put on top of it. Even a regular person can tell, you can see. So sometimes it's very obvious.
Did that happen involving Pharaoh Khufu at all? Because it is claimed, I think even by some in the mainstream, that Khufu's name was not originally in the Great Pyramid, and that was added in later, either in ancient times or in modern times. What's the deal with that?
I think the claim is that it was done in modern times or in the 1800s. There is some graffiti in the Great Pyramid in paint. In some of the interior parts where people weren't going to see, that workers had put in there. And they put their names. The workers had put their names. But also they put the name of the king, King Khufu, in there. So because people don't want the pyramid to have been made during Khufu's reign, they have to somehow come up with an explanation for how that got in there. So they say, oh, it was Howard Weiss, I think they say, this explorer who got in there, one of the early ones, and he deliberately put that in there to deceive everybody. The problem is, number one, some of the graffiti is behind certain stones, so you can Howard Weiss could never have reached it and put that graffiti in there. But also the cartouche that has the king's name. It has a form of the king's name that Howard Weiss would not have known. We only knew later that this was a form of the king's name. So if he was going to forge it, he would put the name in the form that he knew it. But it wasn't. It was in a historically accurate form but he didn't know it. So that's another reason to accept the authenticity.
When they built smaller pyramids later, after the three big ones, and they're crumbling, some people will say that, well, if they really built the three great pyramids, they try to defend their pseudo-history. They're going to say, well, the smaller pyramids are crumbling even to this day. So they say, how do you explain that? What happened there?
Well, I mean, it's kind of similar to what you might say about modern automobiles. They were built like tanks, back in the 40s and 50s, and now they're much more flimsy in many ways, because they're trying to save money and so forth. So just because it's not made as strong, even when we talk about quality, you ever see a building made from back 100 years ago? They put a lot more work into it. Ours are very simple now, very simple buildings. We just get it up and boom, and it's done. They're a lot more functional now. But some of the intricate stonework and how fancy it is from like the 1800s, and you're like, wow, they really put a lot of work into that. Now we don't say, oh, well, clearly that must be newer because look how much better it was built. Therefore, it has to be newer. No, because the reasons why people make things the way they make them, okay, are not just because technology progresses. Or, that's not the only reason there are changes in the way things are made. There are many different reasons for changes. Could be money issue. How much do we have to spend on this? It could be efficiency issue. It could be the priorities of the time. Now in the case of pyramids, we find that after the Great Pyramid, and especially get to Menkaures pyramid and later, there is much better quality temples made around the pyramids than before. So if remember, they're all made together, right? The temples are connected to the pyramids. It's all made together. Okay. Some of the temples at Giza have some great granite work, using just as large stones as you see in the Great Pyramid. If you look at Menkaures pyramid, the pyramid, it has granite around it, right? It's a small pyramid. You might say, oh, it's inferior because it's smaller. And yet it has beautiful granite work. In the temple, the mortuary temple had beautiful granite work, okay? Superior to the Great Pyramid's granite work, okay? The temple, the mortuary temple, is better than the Great Pyramid's mortuary temple. Why? Okay? So not everything becomes inferior as far as you're thinking about sturdiness or something like that. It's just different priorities, okay? Instead of building up, we want to build out. All right. Then you get to like Sahure's pyramid complex at Abu Sir. It's a beautiful complex. It was, in the day, but the pyramid is in terrible shape. Okay. Partly because it was people in the area needed the stones and they dismantled it. It's not just that it fell apart. It's that people took it apart. But the complex around the pyramid is way better than that around Khufu's pyramid. So bigger is not always better. Okay. And look at the pyramid texts in some of the later pyramids. Khufu's doesn't have any wonderful, beautiful hieroglyphic carvings inside. Look at the sarcophagi in the later pyramids. Way better than Khufu's sarcophagus. All right. So you got to look at everything, right? It's not just how tall the pyramid is or how much of it is still standing. There are other things to look at too. And hey, look at Khafre's pyramid right next to Khufu's. Now, it has more of the outer casing on it than Khufu's. So are you going to automatically conclude that, Khafre's is later? It is later, but it's not later because it has some more of the outer casing on it. Yeah, it happened to survive, okay? But that doesn't determine its age. How well it stands up does not determine its age, okay? There's all kinds of other factors involved in how much of the pyramid is going to be left, all right? And they found that there were faster ways to make a pyramid. Think about that too. Are you going to, as you work on pyramids and you get better at making them, are you going to make them harder to make, or are you going to make them easier to make over time? Right? You're going to make them easier to make, and sometimes that involves cutting corners. Okay. You know how hard it was to put all those limestone blocks in the Great Pyramid? It was hard. Okay. So you're going to do it more efficiently later. And another thing, the reason why Khufu's pyramid could be made with all those limestone blocks is because they were right there in the plateau. You just dig in the ground right there, right next to the pyramid. But what happens when you run out? Okay. Now some later king wants to build the pyramid. All right. Well, we got to use this, whatever we have nearby. Okay. And sometimes you just don't have the resources because they're not right there like it was conveniently there for Khufu.
So they would find. Are you suggesting that these stone blocks formed naturally in the ground, or did they form them together?
Well, the limestone itself did. They had to cut them,
Okay.
Chisel them out.
Okay.
But the limestone to make those blocks was there, right? They didn't have to go far, and that's why. And then they made Khafre's, but they were running out clearly by the time they got to Menkaure. Okay. Now, yeah, there's still limestone there, but the plateau, you ran out of room. Okay, you can't build any more pyramids on the Giza plateau. You just can't. There's no room to build more pyramids. So then you have to go somewhere else, like Abu Sir. And they're like, okay, well, we don't have a great limestone quarry right here, so let's use something else. Yeah.
The Mesoamerican pyramids were they built in a similar way to the Egyptian pyramids, or were they built differently?
Not anything in the same way. Now, I'm not an expert on Mesoamerican archaeology, but knowing how the pyramids in Egypt are constructed and what they're made out of and so forth, the Mesoamerican ones, they're limestone. They have limestone. I guess that's a similarity. But they were cut differently. They were moved differently. The shape of the structures is different. There's no comparison really. I mean, you can compare, Okay. But the way that they're made, right? If you look at the components, the ingredients of it, and the shape of the structure and the purpose of the structure, it's all different, you know?
That would definitely be a very easy way for anyone to, like when they look that up and find that out, to tell, oh, we have a problem. Because that is a problem, because for anyone trying to claim they were built by the same civilization, setting aside the different versions of that theory, they were made with different material, not exactly the same material.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, limestone is a great building material, and yes, they did use it because it was there, you know.
Yeah.
I'm trying to picture, like, I think the theory is that survivors of Atlantis or something like that taught people how to make pyramids. I don't know why.
It involves the emerald tablets, because they'll say that in the emerald tablets, Hermes Trismegistus, so this Thoth Hermes, Tahuti Hermes syncretism, syncretistic deity, went to Egypt and taught them how to build those things.
Yeah, does it say why? It's like, okay, taught them how to build it. But I mean, why would they even? You know, why would they need to be taught that, and why would they want to do it?
Right.
You know, and then when you look at the way they used them, they didn't use them the same way. They used them for different purposes. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of like why a survivor from Atlantis would be like, I gotta tell these people, you know, it's very, very important. I have to tell them how to make a pyramid. You know, why? I'm not even sure. But anyway, yeah, it's something called hyperdiffusionism is the term for this. The idea that all ideas come from the same place, right? That people do not think of things independently. No, they must learn it from someone. And so if you find a similarity between two different cultures on opposite sides of the world, you cannot conclude, according to hyperdiffusionism, that they each came up with it on their own. Oh no, they must have learned it from the same source. And it's an extreme view. Yes, I mean, even archaeologists and historians believe that ideas were passed from culture to culture that had contact, cultures that had contact. But this idea that all similarities must go back to a common source, that's a very extreme point of view.
Yep. And I think that is a perfect way of closing this video. So that being said, thank you for joining me today, David. I really enjoyed this discussion.
Well, thank you, Jacob. I appreciated your invitation, and I'm glad to be on.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.